Good evening, good morning, good afternoon from all over the world still coming in. Thank you so much for joining us today for this fourth installment of our special UN Global Compact Academy series focused on uniting business in the response to COVID-19. I'm Lise Kingo, the CEO of the United Nations Global Compact, and we are excited to continue hearing from leaders around the world and to be joined by thousands of people online this week. It's great to have you. Today's Academy session will take a closer look at the economic implications of the crisis and what businesses, investors, and the UN can and are doing to ensure economic resilience in the face of COVID-19. So beyond the daily headlines about the immediate health risks, it's clear that the social impacts of the crisis will have profound consequences for all of us, but will hit those already vulnerable even harder. And as the economic effects become increasingly clear, people are again beginning to question whether the global financial system is fit for purpose in the 21st century. So I'm so delighted to welcome three innovative leaders from the business and financial sector to discuss these topics today. Fiona Reynolds, the CEO of Principles for Responsible Investments, Francesco Starace, the CEO of Enel, and Miguel Nogales, the Chief Investment Officer of Generation Investment Management. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for this important session. Let's get started. So we have all been touched by the severity of the pandemic and the health strategy that is still unfolding in front of us. This crisis is a serious threat, not only to our health, but to our livelihoods, our economies, and our investments. So, for example, IMF estimated last week that GDP is set to fall by 3% this year, and global trade flows could decrease by 32%, according to our colleagues at WTO. So it is fair to say that we collectively face the most challenging economic environment since 1945. At the UN, we are also taking action with our colleagues and of course with the World Bank, and are in the process of creating a 2 billion emergency response fund for the developing population, for the weak people across the world. So to open our discussion today, I would like to hear from each of our panelists briefly how you see this crisis hitting the global economy. What are the main impacts you see, both at a macro level, but also at an individual level? And Fiona, may we start with you?
Thanks, thanks, Lisa. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody. I really hope that everyone's safe and well, but more importantly, that you're happy and healthy. It was so lovely to see all the places where people are from. So I saw from Spain to Montreal, Mongolia, Lebanon, Thailand, Malaysia, Turkey, all over the world. So amazing that you're all here. So I think, to me, that first of all, from a macro level, that the crisis really highlights to me the interconnectedness of issues, particularly sustainability issues, and that we can't uncouple them. So we see that the economy is hit by health issues, and we see that the planet is hit by these issues as well. So there is a lot of interdependency, but I think it also shows that the economy is here to support society, not the other way around. As you said, just really quickly, Lisa, the IMF is forecasting a global growth will fall by -3%. So we're expecting that this will be the worst recession since the global financial crisis, certainly. The IMF has also said that they expect us to see a partial rebound in 2021, so that while this will be deep, we will see a rebound. But they've also said that the loss to global GDP over 2020 and 2021 could be as much as 9 trillion, which is greater than the economies of Germany and Japan combined, just to give people some context. And I think that if you come down to the individual level and the micro level, although we've of course seen unprecedented help for households, for business, for financial markets, we're still of course seeing businesses closing on a daily basis. We're seeing staff being furloughed. We're seeing employment lines growing. You know, in the US, more than 10 million people being made unemployed and predictions of up to 20 million. Which I think shows some fundamental problems for social issues and labour laws, which I hope we can discuss further. But I think overall, no one is immune. No, businesses aren't immune, individuals aren't immune, governments aren't immune, and we're all in this together, and we all need to work together on the solutions.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and I completely agree with you. I mean, no single person have not been touched by the pandemic in each our way across the entire planet. So this has been a spectacular situation and still is. So Francesco, over to you in Italy. How do you see the main impacts, both at a macro level, but also maybe at a more individual level?
Well, thank you, Elise. And again, great idea to organize this kind of webinars. I think it's really interesting to share experiences. And let's reflect on the fact that this is quite an unprecedented situation for the world economy. This is perhaps the first time in which you observe a crisis, a worldwide crisis, not generated by some toxic behavior or some problems intrinsic in the economy itself. Let's not forget the economy was doing okay before this COVID-19 pandemic exploded. It's something that came from the outside. So it's a first of a kind, if you want, in our modern history, when we observe a crisis generated from an external factor driving through an economy that was working pretty well. So what we observe on the macro level is, first of all, the fact that all countries are treated equal by the virus. And therefore, even if governments fail to understand this at the beginning, they sooner or later realize that there is only one way of dealing with it, that is keeping people at home and trying to mitigate the spreading of the virus. And that has a direct impact on the economic tissue of any society. So the funny thing is that this happens in different times. So it's a migration of the virus across the globe that freezes parts of the economies of the world. And the fact that this becomes so obviously clear to us, to all of us right now, is that the world economy is so interdependent and intertwined in its workings, in its inner way of developing, that we cannot unwind it and separate one country from the other, a piece of the economy from the other. It's just a one single system today under some kind of paralysis, because people are locked at home and therefore cannot consume, cannot do whatever their lives was telling them to do. So on a macro level, I think we will have to observe when the lockdown will be lifted in different parts of the world, what will happen. And we have already seen that in China, when the lockdown opened up. In China, factories started working like hell to recover the delays in production programs they had. The logistics got a big logjam of congestion traffic because of all the deliveries coming at the same time to the harbors And we are going probably to see the same thing over and over and over in different parts of the world. Spain and Italy will be the next to open up in a big way, and then the rest of Europe, and then the US, and so forth. That means that the economy will go up and down in kind of bounces as the whole thing will start to roll back again. And in our view, this will take probably for sure through Christmas and probably a good part of 2021. On a micro level, you can say that there are sectors of the economy that are hit before and much more deeply than others. Let's take an example. The air travel industry is deeply in trouble because no one is flying anymore around. All the tourist business segment is clearly in danger of big crisis because people cannot be a tourist locked at home. And other sectors are a lot less impacted, and others paradoxically benefit. For example, the medical industry is definitely not doing bad during a pandemic in general. As we are an energy and electricity company, we are pretty insulated from this kind of crisis because people need electricity anyway, all the time. It's just a different type of consumption, less industry, much more domestic consumption. When people are locked at home, they do whatever, and typically the energy consumption booms. So the issue is that over the unfolding of the year, you need to ensure that the millions of unemployed that are surfacing around the world, and the US numbers are staggering, go back to work in a reasonable amount of time, because if that doesn't happen, then this is not going to be anymore a COVID-19 crisis, but that is going to spin out of control and become a real world recession that would take a longer time to recover. So it's critical that as lockdowns are lifted, people go back to work, and people go back to work in an effective way. So it's only a bridge of a few months that needs to be covered. That is the question that needs to be answered, and that requires a coordinated effort from many companies and many governments around the world. And I think the Global Compact can help in making sure that this transient of going back to work is as short as possible and well coordinated.
Thank you so much, Francesco. I mean, I think your point about all of us being deeply interconnected across the world. They are not a number of separate countries. We are one single planet. We are one single world. We have to work together. Very important. And also important to begin to talk about the recovery that is happening now in several countries, and we need to do that really well. And people from across the world keep on joining us here at the Academy. So it's great to see all the questions and all the people that are coming in. I hope we can manage to respond to some of it. But Miguel, let me turn to you. And I'm very excited to hear from your perspective what you feel are the main impacts of the situation we are in now, both at a macro level, but also at an individual level.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you everybody for joining. I'll just explain for 1 second what we do at Generation, because I think it'll provide some context. So we set up the company 16 years ago with the goal of making long-term investing and sustainable investing mainstream. I would add that Lisa was one of the inspirations for us setting up Generation with her pioneering work on the triple bottom line. So we spent many years trying to mainstream sustainable investing. From a personal perspective, I think we have to start obviously with the extraordinary human impact of this crisis. I'm based in Madrid, and this is something that I feel, I know we all feel. Also, from an individual perspective, it has been very interesting to adapt to working remotely. I think it's taken me some time. I've got 3 kids just around the corner, so I'm hoping they don't run in, playing a trumpet or something. We've had a few of those incidences in our company. So on the macro side, I'll tell you the way that we're thinking about it. Obviously, there's going to be a huge economic impact, multiple trillion, as people have already commented. There's also going to be an enormous coordinated stimulus. This is both fiscal and monetary. It's different to the last crisis in its nature, the stimulus. And, we don't know if the stimulus is going to be too little, too much, just right, or whether there's going to be multiple rounds. What we do know is that the weaponry to deal with this crisis is there and it's ready to be used. Unlike the previous crisis, those weapons are now ready. It took us a lot longer to get them ready last time around. So I think that's kind of the first order impact. We're spending a lot of time as investors thinking about the second order impact. So first of all, when we look at individual industries, we see certain trends that were already underway accelerating. So it could be things like telehealth, it could be things like online, and on the negative side, it could accelerate the stranding of certain assets. I'm thinking here in particularly some of the oil and gas assets. So we're viewing this as an accelerant in many ways of existing trends. Also bear in mind that healthcare investments to GDP have been rising in every country. That's almost certainly going to continue as a result of this. But if I could finish maybe with the biggest thing that we're worried about from a second order impact here. Look, this crisis has come at a time when the economy was to a certain extent deglobalizing or nationalizing, associated sometimes with populism across multiple countries. And, our biggest worry is that this crisis brings an end to multilateralism. So, and international coordination. And there could be a tendency that countries lock themselves in and are scared of things coming from outside their borders. Those things could be a virus, could be a person, could be goods and services. So I would actually say that, beyond the hit of the crisis, the biggest risk is really one of protectionism and lack of international coordination.
Mm-hmm. Miguel, I couldn't agree more. I think we really need multilateralism these days. And we are seeing signs maybe pointing not quite in that direction. But I think we have to use our influence to bring that back on track, because otherwise we are not going to cope with this situation or any situations that will show in the future. So thank you very much, Miguel, for your comments. So I want to go back to you, Francesco. I mean, you're in the middle of leading a large corporation, and you have to make your business decision, your investment decisions as you have normally done. But many companies these days have to make difficult decisions that are impacting their balance sheets. And maybe the business is not looking so good for the rest of the year. So what have you done to balance the short-term decisions you have had to take with maintaining your long-term sustainability commitments that Enel is very known for?
Thank you, Lisa. Indeed, we had to make some decisions that were pretty drastic. While we are talking right now, we have 37,000 of our 70,000 employees working from home across 21 different geographies. And that we accomplished in 10 days. That was the time it took us to move everyone into this cyberspace where everyone is interacting. It was done not because we had to do it, because being an electricity company, we do not have an obligation to shut down. We actually need to be working, but we did it to protect our colleagues. So we established this smart working condition for everyone that has a potential to do something from home. And the other half of our population, which are the technicians that need to be present physically in the power plants and in the networks of our large presence, we completely changed the working shifts, the protocols, the protective gear, the way in which they engage, even the time in which they are present, so that they minimize the risk of being contagious or being exposed to contagion. And we put half of them at home, paid, but at home in standby. And we only focused our activities on one thing only, which is ensure the continuity of service of electricity in all the geographies in which we're present, setting aside everything else. That was a very, very simplified way of working, which kept everyone safe and the lights on, obviously, in all geographies. And that is going on now since about 2 months, a month and a half in Italy and Spain, and a little less in everywhere else. Now, has that had an impact on the company? Not really, because these companies, electricity company typically have a fully hedged year, and provided there are not major disruption from a regulatory standpoint, which didn't happen, not much can happen. So we did not change the guidance for the end of the year. We don't see a reason for it, and maintained our effort of developing and building power plants around the world in all geographies. The building of our renewable energy plants have been kept underway. They were only stopped briefly in Spain because of government intervention, but elsewhere construction is ongoing. So to make a long story short, we don't see an impact on our renewable energy growth in our trajectory of developing the company, okay? We might see it if, like I said before, this becomes an out of control crisis that goes on for many, many years. This is not today in the horizon. It's just an extreme bad variation of this crisis. So for the time being, focus has been health of the employees, continuity of service, and push the construction of power plants. That has been the simplification that we brought to the game. We also drew a special insurance package for all our employees, dedicated on COVID-19. So if you are an employee of Enel and feel sick, go to the hospital, you get a special indemnity on top of what your normal insurance package, just because of COVID-19, you're a victim of COVID-19. And that we did in order to provide additional comfort, not only for the employees that feel sick, but also for their families, because this is today one of the concerns we have, that people working with us be safe and also have their mind clear from all possible worries.
Francesco, thank you. It sounds as if you have followed the Global Compact's call to action very well, starting by taking care of your own people and making sure they are safe, and then really driving the 10 principles across in everything you do. So thank you. Fiona, I would like to turn to you and the great guidance that you and PRI have put out there for investors to make sure that they are not sort of tempted to do short-term decisions these days that will actually lead to value destruction. So could you explain a little bit about how you are working with investors to ensure that they take a long-term view, and how can you support them to keep responsibility in the focus in a moment like this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lisa. Well, obviously for investors, it's a very uncertain time, like for everyone else. And so we want to make sure that investors don't panic, particularly those who are our signatories who are long-term investors. So we've said to investors, they should of course be continuing to support sustainable long-term companies throughout the crisis. And in the interests of public health and long-term economic performance, even if that limits short-term returns. We've said that while of course we don't want to forget about the whole range of sustainability issues that investors focus on, that at the moment what we want to see investors do is to reprioritize their engagements on issues that are not related to COVID-19, recognizing that the key priority for companies at the moment is crisis management. And in the absence of evidence that, you know, companies aren't behaving responsibly, that we should avoid taking time and capacity away from businesses and allow them to get on with what they've got to do. Having said that, of course, we're wanting to ensure that companies are looking after their employees, their supply chains, their suppliers. So those are some of the conversations we're having. We're also speaking to investors about the AGM season that's happening and coming up in other countries. Obviously, has to be a move to virtual AGMs. Some investors have concerns about those. How do I hold people to account? How do I, when it's a virtual meeting? Some companies we've seen are sort of limiting what can happen during a virtual AGM and what questions can be taken and things like those. So that's a concern to people, but we've said, let's participate in the AGM season online. There's obviously also been problems found in that, for example, in Japan, when people went to engage through the AGM season, there was no ability to have virtual AGMs. So people were still having to meet in person. We've also said to investors that they should be receptive to requests for financial support from companies that they consider to be good long-term companies. And that investors should also be supporting an economy-wide response. They should be encouraging both companies and both governments as well to take appropriate action, and action that protects people and includes sustainability as part of particularly the stimulus package response, so that we continue to see support for business and sectors that are good long-term and sustainable investments. And I think Miguel already referenced the fact that we're seeing an acceleration of trends and maybe an acceleration of industries that might not have been around for the long term, and that is happening quicker than might otherwise have been. But I think we do have to be careful with the stimulus packages and the funding that's provided to businesses, that it is to support those that are good long-term sustainable companies, and that's been a strong message from us.
Thank you, Fiona. I think you have provided great guidance, and I know that many are very grateful for that. So Miguel, let's turn to you, because it's actually quite an interesting theme. I mean, for you as a sustainability focused investor, how do you interact and maintain your portfolio companies during a crisis like this? I mean, have some of them gone out of fashion during the recent months, or do you think they are still handling their sustainability responsibility in a good way?
Well, we think sustainability is always in fashion. So let me look. I think that the long-term approach is more important than ever. There's a phenomenon that's well understood by psychologists, which is that at times of fear, our time horizons tend to compress because we go into survival mode. Mm-hmm. And that is something that you definitely see happening amongst companies. So actually, our job as investors is to keep companies focused on the long term. And you know, one of the things that I think people don't appreciate is that whenever you buy a share, so if the market has got, say, a 2% dividend yield, and that dividend grows at 5%, it's going to take you about 40 years to get paid back. So whenever you buy a share, you've already got multiple decades to think about. And I think most people don't understand that. So maybe what I could share is the communications that we're having with our companies. This is taking form, we're writing them a letter, we're also talking to them. So there's basically three elements to our communication. The first one is empathize with the company, recognize the difficulty of the situation, recognize difficult choices have to be made, and also how can we help as investors. Part of that help might be advice, but part of that help is also providing capital. And we have been providing capital to some companies that might have had a debt, too much debt coming into this crisis, but that's our job. That's what we're meant to do. The second element of our communication is very simple, is don't think of the short term. Near-term earnings right now, from our point of view, are completely irrelevant. The market is going to give you what the Americans call a hall pass for this year. And the only thing that you need to think about as a company is your long-term earning power. So make good decisions today that are going to improve your long-term earning power. In the case of some businesses, this is actually a time to step up investment. Certainly not for everybody, but a lot of things are going to be cheaper. Real estate might be cheaper, technology might be cheaper. You might be able to get hold of more human capital. So we are asking companies to actually step up and view this as an opportunity to invest, not just think about the downside of the crisis. Part of not thinking short term is really thinking of all stakeholders and not just shareholders. I know this is weird because we are shareholders, but back to triple bottom line, we feel that if all stakeholders are taken care of, shareholders will actually do much better in the long term. So particularly from the point of view of employees, one of the things that we're seeing in this crisis, and we're encouraging companies, is to be much slower to reduce headcount. And this is happening because people are viewing this crisis as a more temporary event. There's also schemes to do with furlough, which are much more prevalent this time than they were in the last crisis. And one of the things that we are specifically asking companies to do is that compensation structures reflect shared pain across the board. So we're seeing a lot of senior leaders taking significant cuts at the same time that there are some cuts across their employees. I think it's very important from a point of view of solidarity and shared purpose. Finally, in the supply chain, there's a lot of pain. So where companies are working with suppliers, they're seeing a big cash flow strain because payment terms are elongating. So companies like Unilever, for instance, have gone out of their way to support their suppliers. So trying to get companies to think about all stakeholders and actually maybe put shareholders in a bit of a second tier. Final point of our communication is to get companies to double down on climate. And obviously, climate is not number one on the agenda for very good reasons right now. But we're reminding companies that 2020 brought us COVID, but also brought us the Australian bushfires. And 2019 was the second hottest year on record. And climate change is not going away. And we're really trying to get companies to not just honor their commitments to becoming more efficient, reporting, providing science-based targets, but actually stepping up these initiatives. So those are really the main three elements of what we're doing to work with our companies.
Yeah, excellent, Miguel. Thank you so much. And I think bringing up the importance of climate change and that certainly hasn't gone away during the time we have been suffering from the pandemic. Francesco, I also wanted to bring up the issues of the Sustainable Development Goals, because the 2030 agenda is also just waiting there around the corner for us to pick that up even bigger time than before the pandemic. So, I mean, I know that Enel has been very engaged in setting up a CFO task force to make CFOs consider much more the SDGs as a lens for all the investments in the company. So how do you see the SDGs as a way of focusing the recovery of the companies?
You know, if I can comment on what Miguel just said, I think that the SDGs are even more today than before a key element for the development of the society around the world. You know, if there is a case that can be made on COVID, is that it shows us brutally how a mistake or something that spins out of control can really wreak havoc everywhere in the world. And I think climate is close to becoming one of these crises that will sooner or later really become tangible in globally around the world. It's true that 2019 was a very warm and very hot year, but it's not the first, it's not probably going to be the last. 2020 might be another very hot year so far. Now, I've heard many times, and I've received so many questions also from investors. Are you slowing down your renewable energy efforts because of COVID-19? Are you concerned that the low oil prices and low gas prices that are a result of the lack of demand, that also COVID-19 is slowing the development of renewables? Are you going to change your mind around this subject? And the answer is very clearly no. Actually, if there is a case that can be made about COVID-19, is that it is an incredible accelerator of that renewable energy trend so far. It's clear, if there was a need of proof, it's now in front of us, that fossil fuels demand is going to be dropping, and that is something we anticipated was going to happen. It's just accelerated. I think Miguel used that word. It's an accelerating factor of a trend that was already underway. So we're doubling down on growth. We had a 2020-2030 10-year scenario developed, and with an ambition of what we want to be in 2030, which will be disclosed to the financial markets in November this year. But it's clearly, I can tell you, telling us that we have to accelerate and not decelerate the development of renewable energy around the world and the digital transformation of networks, which needs to be there if this has to take place in a big way, and needs to be there if we want to transform the way in which we live in cities. What I can tell you also, apart from the renewable energy growth that is needed to combine to combat climate change, is that the way in which we work, the way in which we move ourselves around big cities, around big metropolitan areas in the world, this is something that COVID-19 has clearly shown to be stupid. You know, we will learn from these months of lockdown different ways of working that might make the life in cities more sustainable, less congested, more friendly, more human, much better from many standpoints. And we are committed to bring this experience into our workforce, into the way we work going forward. What sense does it make after we have passed months working in an effective way and moving a lot less our bodies around to the office from home? What sense does it make that we go back to that pattern before? What sense does it make that we get in our cars, congest the streets, move around? Why can't we just change a little bit our habits? And by the way, I think if there was a learning from all this experience, is that this can be done. It can be done, and it can be done in a pretty straightforward way. It doesn't need a lot of training. So it's a new SDG horizon, and you know there are SDG 7 and SG 9 and SG 11 that cope with this digital transformation and large cities that have in their own slow development an intrinsic accelerator because of COVID-19. And we are committed to put a lot of emphasis on these two SDGs to bring forward the experience that we are all making around the world in this field. So it's I think it's a big potential for an acceleration in the SDGs.
Thank you, Francesco. And in trying to monitor all the different questions that are coming in from our audience across the world, I can tell you it'll be difficult. It will be impossible to respond to all of them now, but we will make sure to come back to you.
I see a lot of questions.
Very good questions. But there's a red line between a series of the questions, which goes back to your remarks, Francesco, which is, what can we learn from this crisis to recover better and stronger? And I would like to just have the final words from the panel on what is your one or two key pieces of advice for exactly how to do that. So Fiona, what's your thinking?
Okay, well, I think in the spirit of you should never waste a good crisis, as they say, I think that what this has shown to me is look at what governments, business, investors, civil society, when they come together, can do to solve an unseen threat that we don't really, know exactly how it's going to play out. It's been really amazing, the action that has been taken. And I think we have to take this learning into how we deal with many other problems. And I would like to see the same sense of urgency about the globe having to come together and the different actors in the world into the climate change problem. I also think that what we've seen from this response, as I said in the opening remarks, is that interconnectedness, so that investors, business, governments, we can't hide from externalities. They're going to hit us, so we need to be thinking about them. So I think sustainability issues and long-term issues will only have more focus in the future. I think that far from it be something that people won't focus on, I think it's going to accelerate. But I do think that one of the things that responsible investors and responsible business needs to focus on more, and government, is social issues. So we are seeing, the problems that happen with employment in the gig economy. We're seeing problems for employees who are employed in countries that don't have strong labour laws. And there has not been enough focus on the issues around decent work and social issues. So from my perspective, from the PRI and from the whole investment community, this is something we have to be doing far more about going further, because I think COVID-19 just exacerbates and shows more about these inequalities, both between developed and developing countries, but even within developed countries. Some of us have the luxury of just being able to work from home. We can homeschool our kids. There might be a little bit of inconvenience in our life, but that's all. Others, are on the unemployment line with very little help, and their world is really turned upside down, and we need to think about that more.
Yeah. Fiona, it's such a good point that the pandemic really has underlined the importance of scaling up social responsibility in the world, the human rights, the labor rights. I think that's there as a big challenge for all of us, of course, along with the climate challenge. So thank you, Fiona. Great points. And over to you, Miguel. What are your main learnings that you think can help us recover better after the pandemic?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that's been really amazing from my perspective is how, fast and well some companies have been able to react, particularly when working alongside the government. So I'll just share one story. So we are investors in, US company Becton Dickinson. They've produced a, rapid antibody test. And, they told me that normally this would have taken them 3 years to produce. Testing, but a lot of time getting lost in the legal documentation. And basically they said, we were able to do it in a month rather than 3 years, because everybody let their guard down and everybody started working together. So different companies, also the regulators. And I think this is an incredible example of what businesses can achieve when they're focused, but also when they have support of, the government entities and regulators that surround them. So I think that's an incredibly inspirational story, and maybe a sign of what we can do for climate. The second area that I'm trying to think about, and I don't have any answers, is, obviously these government interventions, be it on the monetary side or the fiscal side, are going to be huge. And, why shouldn't they be somehow linked to some expectations on climate action? So, if governments are bailing out energy intensive industries, let's say airlines, there's others, why shouldn't that be linked to some commitments on, a path towards, more aggressive path towards decarbonization? So I think that it's obviously risky if government begins to direct too much, but I don't see why we can't at least have that conversation about having some expectation of decarbonization if you're going to take public money.
Thank you, Miguel. So, we actually have a question which relates to the connection between the pandemic and climate, and the fact that the COP26 has now been postponed. And the question is, does that mean that climate change is now down prioritized? So from your perspective, what's the urgency of climate at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think that it is totally natural and understandable when you have, a very severe loss of life, when you have healthcare systems under pressure. I think it's very natural that on a temporary basis, this moves into a second plane. But on the other hand, actually, I think it reinforces the fact that as humans, we're not very good at dealing with long-term threats, which experts are telling us are going to happen. And there were experts that, have warned on pandemics, and there are experts that are warning on climate. So I think that this will reinforce the fact that as humans, we're not very good at dealing with big systemic issues. It's natural that in the near term, we're all focused on other things. But as we begin to emerge, I think there are certain elements like clean streets, clean air, clean water, that I think maybe we won't want to give up as we come out of the confinement.
Thank you, Miguel. And we have the young people, the young generation. We have also young people in this session asking questions exactly along these lines. So there are good things that we have learned and seen during this crisis, and we definitely want to maintain them. So we have come to the end of the session. I want to thank all of you out there across the world for joining this session on sustainable finance and the future of the global economy. Next week's session will focus on COVID-19 and human rights, protecting the most vulnerable, just as we were touching upon in this session as well. So every Academy session is available online afterwards. I hope you will share them with your friends, networks, and family. And I would like to end by extending our huge appreciation to our three wonderful panelists here today. So from all of us at the UN Global Compact across the world, I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay well.